You would have thought that bringing Hedges and Marr together in the Church of Late Night Live, it'd be a very happy marriage. But it wasn't to be. At the end of it, there was one of them left standing, and it wasn't David Marr. G'day, Ranter here. If you're part of that tiny slice of the Australian population interested in the ABC, journalism standards, history, current affairs, then you would be aware that there was a bit of a storm recently over an interview David Marr hosted with American journalist Chris Hedges on his show Late Night Live on Radio National. That storm, I guess, has passed now, as these things do, and I reckon that makes this a pretty good time to revisit it for a bit of a think about it again. Now, if you don't know who these people are, well, David Marr is probably Australia's one of our most respected progressive writers. He's a big thinker, he's a big writer, he's had huge output. He's also been a broadcaster for a long time. He has been a journalist since, I guess, the early 80s. I've been following him certainly since then, even back when I was a journalism student. Marr's guest was Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize winner, former Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, a guy who 2 decades ago quit his job at the New York Times because he was being, constrained in what he could say about the Iraq War way back then. And that's where he developed great expertise in the Middle East, and he's had it and developed it ever since. And now I guess he's an independent thinker and writer, and he's been very vocal about Israel's war in Gaza. I've only really become fully aware of Hedges in the last year or so, and I'm a very big fan. So my dilemma in this storm is that I've had an enormous respect for David Marr going back decades. I've had a great regard for the program Late Night Live because I've been listening to that for decades. It was one of my ways of staying in touch with the world when I was living in Vietnam. And so I've loved Late Night Live, and I have recently come to respect enormously Chris Hedges too. So you would have thought that bringing Hedges and Marr together in the Church of Late Night Live, it'd be a very happy marriage. But it wasn't to be. As it turns out, Marr from the outset was on the attack. It was a very hostile interview, and it went nowhere really because it didn't succeed in teaching us anything about Hedges, and it denied us a lot too. And I guess now with a bit of distance, I have 3 reflections on that interview that I think, are worth registering, I think. But the first is that David Marr I think he failed himself as a journalist because he spent 23 minutes going nowhere. His mission, his project, he was badly briefed. He got off to a bad start by making a strange case about the credibility of Hedges. And Marr got his facts wrong on that. And then he just continued to try and create a case that Hedges wasn't really well qualified to make the points he was making. And he failed. Hedges batted every accusation away very successfully, very calmly. Hedges and Marr together, you're talking about 2 big brains. But at the end of it, there was one of them left standing, and it wasn't David Marr. And that's a rare thing. I've been watching David Marr for a very long time. I've rarely seen him so poorly briefed. The other thing about this was that it was totally out of step with the style of the Late Night Live show. Late Night Live is not like a hard talk show. You don't bring guests on to, rip them to shreds. You bring guests on usually because they're expert, well-qualified people, able, even if you're the host and you disagree with them, you might voice that occasionally or you might challenge them. But it's not a program that has historically been about confrontation. That's never been the vibe of Late Night Live. Probably the most disappointing thing about David Marr's, what I would call failed interview with Chris Hedges, was that Marr made a judgment that Hedges had nothing of really important value to share with the Late Night Live audience, but instead it was more important that he be confronted on matters of integrity or credibility. And as I've said, he batted away all of that perfectly well. This is a guy who knows how to defend himself. Hedges was in Australia to talk about the death of journalists, the murder of journalists during the war in Gaza. And that's such an important subject. And you would have thought David Marr would also find that a subject worth discussing. And it didn't get a look in, or barely got a look in the interview. But Hedges is an expert on Gaza as well, very well qualified to speak on that. And lastly, Hedges is a really interesting man, quite separate to his recent Gaza writing. He's a guy who is actually a Presbyterian minister, so he's a trained theologian, but he's a really interesting commentator on the Christian right in America. This is a big story of our time. Marr said, no, that's not interesting. He's also a guy who teaches in prisons in America. So you've got a guy that's got enormous qualification to talk about the Middle East, enormous qualification to talk about Gaza, enormous qualification to talk about the impact that the Christian right is having on American democracy, and also someone with a lot of other insights because he's been doing really interesting things for a long time. Marr basically shut all that down and decided to spend 23 minutes on a failed mission. I explain all this in much more detail on the blog, so check that out over at innerwestrant.com.au. In the weeks since the big Chris Hedges, David Marr storm, I've continued listening to Late Night Live, and I continue to find it one of the best things the ABC does. And what I find interesting listening to the shows after that is how out of step David Marr was with his own style, and how out of step he was with the whole format and style of the program of Late Night Live. And I think that needs to be explained. I'd love to hear David Marr write a note to the loyal listeners of Late Night Live. If he hasn't already, I haven't seen anything. He might have done something. Check out the blog at innerwestrant.com.au, and you can subscribe to the blog for more rants. And you can also subscribe to this channel for more rants. Thank you. Talk soon.